For 2 decades, the story was simple. China was building Africa. From the railway connecting the Ethiopian highlands to the port of Djibouti, to the power plants lighting up Nigeria's cities, to the bridges spanning forgotten rivers. The narrative was one of partnership, of investment, of a new world rising. But the data has just flipped. The numbers are now going the other way. Between 2015 and 2019, China sent a net flow of $30 billion into Africa. New loans were arriving faster than old ones were being repaid. That was the era of the Belt and Road, the great infrastructure push. Between 2020 and 2024, Africa sent $22 billion more back to China than it received in fresh financing, a $52 billion reversal. The debt collector has replaced the builder. The repayment era has begun. We are officially in the era of the great reversal. And the question every African must ask is this: what did we get for that borrowing? And who will pay the price? Let us look at the map. The pressure is not evenly distributed. Zambia. Once hailed as a model of African growth, it became a test case for debt distress. After years of negotiations, Zambia finally restructured billions of dollars of its foreign debt, including loans from China. China is now Zambia's largest bilateral creditor. The Zambian kwacha has suffered, inflation has soared, and the country has been forced to accept harsh fiscal adjustments just to keep the lights on. Kenya. The Chinese-built standard gauge railway was supposed to be Kenya's engine of development. A $5 billion line connecting Nairobi to Mombasa, financed by the China Exim Bank. Now Kenya is struggling under the weight of the repayment schedule. In a desperate move, Kenya successfully converted about $5 billion in railway loans from dollar to yuan, hoping to ease the burden of interest payments. A smart move, perhaps, or perhaps just a deferral of the inevitable. Mozambique, a nation sitting on one of Africa's largest natural gas fields. Yet, by May 2026, Mozambique was already in default risk, planning to convert $1.4 billion of its Chinese debt into yuan, desperate to reduce the pressure on its foreign reserves. But these are not isolated cases. Across the continent, the pattern is the same. Infrastructure was built, the ribbon was cut, and now the bill has arrived. China is facing a slowing domestic economy. Its foreign reserves are under pressure. The central government in Beijing is tightening its belt, and that means the era of easy infrastructure credit is over. Chinese lending to developing countries has dropped dramatically. The dragon is not retreating entirely. It is pivoting to a different and perhaps more dangerous form of penetration: trade and currency control. They are no longer just building your roads. They are taking control of your reserves. The China International Development Cooperation Agency announced at the 2026 Forum on China-Africa Cooperation (FOCAC) a commitment to Africa of $60 billion over the next 3 years, plus an additional $20 billion through credit lines. But look closely. Much of this is not new cash for construction. It is aid packaged with conditions, support for military cooperation, and yuan-denominated credit lines. The critics in Washington call this a debt trap. The defenders in Beijing call it win-win cooperation. But whatever you call it, the control is shifting. Some Western analysts have claimed that China's overseas asset seizure strategy is a myth. They have pointed out that China rarely seizes sovereign assets and has actually forgiven billions of dollars in interest-free loans for 17 African countries. But here is the nuance. Beijing has moved toward a more dangerous, less visible form of penetration: trade and currency control. They are no longer just building your roads. They are taking control of your reserves. The more immediate challenge for African governments is the creeping influence of a yuan-centric financial ecosystem. Zambia is beginning to accept mining taxes in yuan. Kenya converted its railway loans to yuan. Ethiopia is in talks to follow suit. The yuan still makes up only about 3% of global forex reserves, but its share is growing. And with growth comes dependency. When a country's debts are denominated in yuan and its revenues are still largely in depreciating local currencies, it is caught in a vice with no escape route. Let us not forget the human costs, because behind every billion-dollar restructuring, there are real people. In Lusaka, Zambia, budget cuts have meant fewer teachers in schools and longer queues at clinics. In Nairobi, the government has hiked fuel taxes to free up revenue for debt servicing. In Maputo, public sector wages have lagged far behind inflation, while interest payments to Chinese creditors have been prioritized. These are the invisible victims of the Great Reversal, not the politicians in air-conditioned meeting rooms, not the economists with their spreadsheets, the parent who cannot afford to send their child to school, the patient who cannot afford the medicine. This is sovereignty under pressure, and it is happening right now across the continent. There is another layer to this story, one that the mainstream press often misses. The shift in Chinese lending has come just as Western-backed multilateral institutions, like the World Bank and the IMF, have stepped into the void. During the same period, multilateral development banks increased their net financing to Africa by an incredible 124% over the past decade, now providing 56% of net financing flows to the continent, totaling roughly $379 billion. So here is the uncomfortable truth. Africa is now caught in a pincer movement. On one side, China demands repayment. On the other, the IMF and World Bank demand structural reforms. The continent is squeezed from both directions, and the debtor is always the one who pays the price. One Western counterpoint gaining traction is the claim that China's debt is actually the most concessional of any major creditor. Some analysts have pointed out that many of the interest-free loans extended by Beijing have longer repayment periods and lower interest rates than loans from the Paris Club. But this argument ignores a larger reality. Even concessional loans must be repaid, and when your national income is not growing fast enough, even low interest can become a burden. This does not mean that China is an enemy of Africa. That is too simplistic. China remains a vital trading partner, a source of manufactured goods, a market for African minerals, and a diplomatic ally. And there is a strong argument that the crisis of debt-trap diplomacy has been exaggerated by Western interests seeking to undermine Chinese influence. But neither is China a purely benevolent partner. The interests of nations rarely align perfectly, and right now China's interest is in getting its money back. Africa is not a victim in this story. It is not a pawn, but it is a collection of creditors and borrowers that must navigate this new reality with its eyes open. At the 2026 Forum on China-Africa Cooperation, African negotiators finally showed signs of a more assertive posture. The joint declaration contained stronger language on debt restructuring mechanisms and greater transparency in lending terms. There were hints that future Chinese lending would be more aligned with African development priorities, rather than simply pushing infrastructure that serves Chinese construction firms. But promises are cheap. The test will come when the next round of budget negotiations begins and the creditors come calling. For the African Union, the task is urgent. The continent must find ways to pool its bargaining power, to negotiate collectively rather than as 54 separate countries. It must invest in productive capacity, factories, agriculture, technology, so that borrowed money generates the growth needed to repay it. And it must build regional supply chains and financial systems that reduce dependency on any single external partner. The Chinese dragon has not abandoned Africa, but it has changed its posture. It is no longer a builder. It is a landlord collecting rent. The question for African leaders is simple. Are you ready to negotiate? For a generation, African leaders played a dangerous game. They borrowed from China to build the roads and bridges that Western donors refused to finance. And for a while, it worked. The ribbon cuttings were beautiful. The infrastructure was real. The growth was visible. But now the bills have come due. China has become a net collector, pulling $22 billion more out of African economies than it is putting in. And the IMF, the European Union, and the World Bank have filled the lending void, but with strings attached. Africa borrowed the money, Africa spent the money, and now Africa must pay it back. The Great Reversal is not an accident. It is not a conspiracy. It is the arithmetic of a relationship that has entered a new, more complicated, more demanding phase. The question now is whether Africa will remain a debtor, forever servicing the loans of the past, or whether we will use this moment of reckoning to build something new, a continent that invests its own capital in its own future. The era of easy money is over. The era of accountability has begun. This is Voice of Africa. We do not shy away from the hard questions. If you believe African nations must control their own economic destiny, share this video, subscribe, and comment below. Where are you watching from? Lusaka, Nairobi, Maputo, London, New York. The world is listening.